The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. This workshop uses process flow to create a custom registration form. This example registration form is for training purposes only. In no way does it replace the existing base registration form. Welcome back to Lesson 8 of this Config Tools class. Here we will be discussing BO validation and different types of validation. Validation which you can put directly within the BO as defining required fields, required elements, creating validation algorithms so that you can make slightly more sophisticated type of validation. And then we can add in and create even a different state within the actual life cycle, a validation state which can do even more sophisticated type of validation. And we will be taking our registration form example and enhancing it as we've done throughout. And here we will be formatting our ID type and value and showing you how that can be done with an algorithm. And we will also be adding a validation state that can check for the existence of a person entity within the system before actually attempting to create a new one. Registration form. Now, currently, if I actually go and try to create a registration form, let's take the business one for example. And I try to save it without filling in the ID number or the name, the system allows me to save. How can I validate that data is correctly added, that it exists and it's in the right format? So a simple standard way of doing that would be to go to the business object and go to the particular schema and I can say this particular field, business name, I can make that a required field. In a similar way, I can go to the parent registration form and I can go to the schema and I can there make, let's say, the ID number a required field. If I now create a registration form, and I try to save, it says the ID number is missing. This field is missing. This is the validation on the particular field on the parent, and let's say I now put something in and I try to save again. And then we have the validation now on the child, on the child business registration BO. And then that works like that. Now, if I try to do the same thing on the individual one, so here I haven't added any validation on the name, so I don't have any validation. Now, I could go into that particular BO, the child BO, and make these fields required. However, if I actually want to do something a little bit more sophisticated, and I want to have only that the validation should work that either first name or last name should be true, then have to be filled in, then I might actually have to do the validation using a BO validation algorithm. So let me show you how we do that. I can go to algorithms over here, and I have here one of these system events is validation. And I have one already, and we're going to look at this one in a second. If I go to the validation script, so the schema for this particular plugin has soft parameters if we have soft parameters on the algorithm, and under the hard we have the ID, we also have the entity, we have the MO, we also have the new business object and the original business object, because we have data of the old data which is in the system. That think about there has been an update to an object, and there was existing data, and that would be found in the original BO, and the new BO would have the updated data. And you could actually imagine you could have a comparison between the new and the old and some sort of validation like that. In terms of what we are doing here, what I've done in my example, show you in the code over here. The code which I have here is simply to check to see if the first name and the last name is blank. Then I should error. And this error message, this is a message category and message number, would have to be filled in the message a section in admin. So this corresponds to make sure that at least the first name or the last name exists. So if I now go back and try to create a do we have a BO here? Individual one. So this is a individual. If I edit this and now I try to save, it should come up with an error. Either first name or last name, it must be supplied. But once I put in just one of these fields, then it accepts it, because that's the validation that I wanted. So what if I would like to have more sophisticated validation? You see over here that I have an ID number which is not in the standard format. What happens if I want to validate to make sure that the ID number that I have entered is in the correct format? How would I do that? Since this type of validation is true for both the business and the individual, let me do that on the parent. So let me go to the parent BO. And here, in a similar way that I did on the individual, I added in validation. I can add in another validation, and here I'm going to add in some parent validation. What does this parent validation do? Well, let's have a look. We always start validation by ignoring anything to do with the action of delete, because we don't need to validate in that situation. We can directly put in validation, a very simple validation, similar to that we had by creating a required field on the BO directly, but in code you could simply add in the validation algorithm to say if there's no ID value given, then return a message, an error message. This gives you the flexibility to create your own messages if you don't find that the standard messaging of required fields is sufficient. Now, in this particular case, I've taken out the ID type from the registration form type and read the BO, and so for the registration form type, I'm going to read and get the ID type, and then I'm going to invoke the business service validate person number format to make sure that the format is in the right format that it should be. And then what I do is, if it is in the wrong format, I return an error. Okay, and that is the particular script that I have over here. So in the data areas, I have the business services that I'm going to use, and in the step is the code which we just saw. So if I go back now to my process flow, the registration form that I just created, we saw the ID number is 77. If I edit this now and try to save it, I come up with my own message saying that the ID number 77 is not in the correct format, and it will not allow me to save until I actually create the correct format. What we also see here is that you could have validation on the parent and also have validation on the child, and both of them work and are basically hit. First, the parent is triggered, and then the child is triggered. And in fact, if we add in the required fields that we see directly on the BO, the order of triggering the different validations places are, first of all, the BO required fields, and then the parent validations, and then the child validations. So now we have the code which is needed to validate a particular registration form with ID formats and numbers and also names. I didn't particularly go into depth about how this works, but again, the main use of this main particular piece of code is using the business service ID type validate person number format, and we fill in the ID type and the number, and it tells you whether it's in the correct format. Okay, so, and we have our own message that we created using these %1, %2 allows us to fill in particular values corresponding to the %1 and 2 that I've defined in my messages. Now, there's another aspect of validation that I would like to discuss, and this is different than just field validation. Here I want to validate something which is much more specific to this registration form, and that is what happens if the existing there is an existing user in the system. This is not a great example. Let's say a particular user and ID exists in the system, and we try to create the same one again using a registration form. So here I would like to do a check before I actually create a new person to check to see whether they already exist in the system. Okay, so if I have a look at if I actually look at I believe there is someone in the system. Let's have a here John Doe in the system. And John Doe exists, and I know that the ID number here is all 6s. What happens if I actually now, right this moment, try to create a new registration form for John Doe with the same name? Do I actually want to create a new user with the exact same information? Can I even create one like that? So if I actually go and try to do that currently, say I use all the 6s, and this is the ID number that already exists for John Doe, and I just put in, I try to save that. Let me activate that. So there's a warning. This person with a number has the same ID, continue. So it actually tells me a warning, and I would be able to create the same user with the same ID. Now I don't want to do that. In fact, what I actually would prefer my registration form to do is to do a check to see whether that user exists. If it exists, simply put the person ID on my registration form, but don't create another user. Okay, at least that's the business rule that I would like my registration form to follow. How would I do that? Well, what I'm going to do is go to my parent registration form, and I'm going to add in a new state. Again, this is just my way. It can be done in multiple ways. This is a pattern, though, that we use in our own base registration forms in the system for tax forms as well, that we do a check to see that there's existence on a state called a validate state. And I'm going to do something similar as well and show you how to do that and add in the code that we need. So in the life cycle over here, sorry, I'm on the child. I need to go to the parent, because it's the parent who controls the life cycle for both the parent and the child. So I'm going to add in here a new state. Now I'm going to call this one validated. And save that first, I think. So we've added in a state called validated. However, I haven't changed my access mode, inquire. I now have to change my next statuses. The next status after pending is not active but validated now. I want to change this to validated. So I've added in a state validated for the next status. In the validated state, I want to have the next status to be the active state. And let me save that. So I have now three statuses: pending, validated, and active. And the idea is that on the pending state, I just save the data. I do basic validation when it enters that state. It's the validation algorithms that I set on my on the child and on the parent, and I also do the validation on the fields if I create them required. And then in the validated state, I'm going to add in some code which checks to see whether this user already exists in the system, and if it does, it's going to set the person ID directly and automatically then transition to the active state. So in the algorithm here, and the enter algorithm, I'm going to add in a new algorithm which is going to be called check person existence. I save that. And let's have a look at the check person existence algorithm that I have created over here. If I go to my code, check person, you will see that this is what I do. First of all, I read the registration form BO. I get the ID type, and I get the value and pass it into the business service called check taxpayer existence. And then I also pass in the name. If it's a business, then I can just move the business name directly into this business service, into the taxpayer name. If it happens to be a individual, I need to actually do some concatenation. I need to use a XPath function to create the first name, last name. So it's basically in format of last name, comma, space, first name, and put that into the taxpayer name. And I can use a setting to decide whether I will use a fuzzy search, whether I do an exact or non-exact. A fuzzy search is a non-exact, a semantically similar sounding name as the one I have in, and then I can run the business service check taxpayer existence, and then what I get back as a result is whether the user exists, the actual name exists in the system, and whether the ID exists. And if I find that the taxpayer identifier exists and the name exists, then what I'm going to do is just simply say, okay, I found the right person, exists in the system already, let me set my person ID in the registration form, and then I'm going to simply go to the next status. By setting the active to the next status, it will auto transition to the active state. Of course, that itself would be a problem, because when it enters the active state, we have code which says create the user again. However, we have also updated the create person code such that if the person ID already exists and has been set in the validate state, then it's terminate. So in fact, you will see over here that I've added in another clause into the create person, which is run at the activate state, the active status as we enter that state, to check to see whether the person ID exists. If it exists already, meaning that has already been set because I already found one at the validate state, then it simply will do nothing. It won't create a new one, and everything will be fine. If, on the other hand, we have no ID number or the name, both of them are actually not found yet in the system, then it will simply pass through, nothing will happen. This particular check person will finish checking and nothing will happen. It will enter then the create person and it will create the person as expected. Finally, though, if we have a mismatch, we have a name in the system that exists but not the ID or vice versa, then an error will be shown, because that is a situation we wouldn't expect, that the ID will be found but the name isn't, or name found, ID isn't. Again, all dependent upon the business rules that you need to implement. This is the example I'm using. So this is the code, and I plugged this in on the validated state, and that should mean that if I now run this registration form again, then I will not be able to create a duplicate for this particular user. So in other words, we had, let's go back for a second. If I go back to the process flow over here, I think I actually have to create a new one. No, it's a validate state. This is the John Doe. Now instead of here, when I hit validate, before it said activate. Now because I've added a new state into the parent, I now have a validate state, and we'll see whether it actually can find John Doe in the system. And let's see what happens. So what actually happened now was that in the validate state, it did a check, a lookup on the username and ID, found John Doe in the system, set the person ID, and then auto-transitioned to the active state. However, it didn't create John Doe twice, because again, in the code that creates a person, it first of all checked to see whether person ID is already set. It happens to be set, so therefore it will skip that and not create a new one. So this is a different concept of validation. This is not a validation algorithm. I use this as a BO enter spot to do a check existence validation. But what I wanted to show you in this lesson were different types of validation. Standard validation can be done through validation algorithms directly on the BO, whether it's on the parent or on the child BO. You can also do validation directly on the BO to create a particular field as a required. And then you can also do much more sophisticated. We saw an example of a validation as well for format as well. We called a business service to see that the format of the social security in this case is in the right format. We plug that on to on the parent, common for both the business and the individual. And then finally we saw a different type of validation of check existence, which we did by creating a new validation state and check to see whether this user and ID is unique. Has it been already found in the system or not? And we created there a new state and a new BO enter plugin in order to do that check existence algorithm. So there are different things that we've learned in this lesson. There are different types of validation, and each one needs a slightly different approach and technically implemented in a different way. The simplest type of validation is a required element, where you can directly on the BO say it's a required, and that will just simply validate to make sure that data exists. If you need a little more sophisticated validation, you can use a validation algorithm which is on the BO. We use this in this particular lesson to make sure the ID value is formatted correctly. If there is some sort of validation based upon multiple fields, multiple elements, that if you both have to be filled in of one and not the other, then a validation algorithm is a good place to do that. If you want customized message, if the validation is incorrect, and it might not be sufficient to just define a required element directly on the BO, so you can actually define your own messages. However, validation of the algorithm simply will check to see whether the data is correct, and if it's not, it will come up with a message. It won't do any more sophisticated work like if the data is missing, or what you want to actually create and do something more sophisticated, like transition the data, the actual record, to a different state, then that approach needs to be slightly different, and we often introduce a validate state within our BOs and then create separate validation BO enter algorithm spots, and they're not actually validation algorithms, but we now have a validate state, and we can do whatever we want within that state, and we can determine based upon the results of our validation whether we want to continue, move it to different states, and so on and so forth. So there's all different mechanisms in order to do your validation that you need.